Good evening, citizens of Portsmouth. I now call the work session meeting to order. And Madam Clerk, would you call the roll, please?
Yes, sir. Mr. Barnes.
Present.
Mr. Battle is not here. Mrs. Lucasberg. Here. Mr. Moody.
Here.
Dr. Whitaker. Mr. Woodard.
Here.
Mayor Glover.
Here. I would now ask our city manager, Ms. Tonya Chapman, to please proceed with your items, ma'am.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, Mayor Glover, Vice Mayor Barnes, members of Portsmouth City Council, and Portsmouth family. Today we have two presentations and an overview of an unfinished business item. Our first presentation will be on our utility bond sale, and Mr. Kyle Lux of Davenport and Company will provide the Utility Enterprise Fund Capital Funding Update. Mr. David's going to do it. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Rose, good to see you, sir.
Thank you, Mayor. Again, I'm David Rose, and Kyle is my esteemed partner. I was here in June, so we thought I would maybe continue this, present, and Kyle can correct me for all the things I say incorrectly. That's how it works. At the same time, I understand we've got the 7 o'clock public hearing, and I certainly plan to be here for that if council wishes to answer any questions from the public.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
So if I could, all of you should have a copy of what is on the screen being seen by the folks behind me and on the television. We'd like to give you an update on the capital funding plan, which we talked about in June, got your approvals, and here we are tonight to give you, as I said, an update and talk about next steps. So with that said, just to remind everyone, the City of Portsmouth has a self-supporting utility enterprise fund. This covers your water and sewer system. It is self-supporting because those that actually use the system pay for the system. You do not use monies from the general fund to take care of the enterprise fund. It's one of the reasons why the city enjoys a very strong credit rating in the general fund, because these monies do not in any way take away from the general fund. That said, we talked back in June about doing and moving forward for roughly $30 million of capital improvements through the fund, and doing that issuance through the Virginia Resource Authority, which is our state program. You may recall I also indicated at that time that it's not automatic. We had to go through a process. We did, working with your staff, and as a result of that, they provided us a term sheet which we found fully acceptable and met all of the criteria that allows the city to move forward in an expeditious manner. In addition, we also talked about in June having an additional $5 million from a low-interest revolving fund loan that together will provide you the funding for the next, if you want to call it, iteration of capital needs for the enterprise fund. So, with that said, the next steps here tonight is we are here to ask you to approve moving forward with the VRA loan. We are required, as we mentioned, to have a public hearing, and that is why we'll be here at 7 o'clock. Bond Counsel, which is your outside legal advisors, they actually put the ordinance together. It was fully and properly advertised in the newspaper, and as a result, gets you in a position to move forward with the program, which is scheduled for sometime in late October. So that's when the interest rates are actually set. One of the reasons to do this $25 million is in part to reimburse ourselves, meaning ourselves, the city, for $10 million that you've already spent. That's what we talked about in June. Nothing has changed. And an additional $15 million of new money to do additional projects. On top of that, the $5 million that I mentioned earlier, so in total, the $30 million. So nothing has changed, but again, just wanted to make sure everybody, all the topics that you have are up to speed on where we've been, where we're going, again, with your approvals. So, that said, we expect the sale to be roughly on or about October 25th, and the way this will be paid back is what we call a security of revenues, a net revenue pledge, if you would, of your funding from the water and sewer system. So again, it keeps the city's general fund separate and distinct. What I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about your portfolio. We did this the last time, and I thought it would be helpful to once again give everyone, particularly those that are seeing this for the first time in terms of public hearing, an opportunity to understand what your portfolio looks like in the area of the Utility Enterprise Fund. The total green there is the existing debt. The light green is what we estimate for the new debt. Right now, we're estimating an interest rate of 5%. However, the interest rate right now is closer to 4%. We like to err on the high side. Obviously, these bonds will be issued what they call competitively, meaning anybody and everybody that wants to will be able to compete for the interest on these bonds, and that'll occur, as I said, roughly about the end of October. And so the way the state works, whoever is willing to pay the lowest interest rate ends up winning the bond issue, and we hope that it'll be something closer to 4% versus the 5% range. Now, what I wanted to point out and to make sure we all see is this is really just, yes, Mayor, I'm sorry.
Mr. Rose?
Yes, sir.
I understand the 4 versus the 5%, and you said you aim high on the interest rate. It can't go above 5%, though, right?
It can go above 5%. Okay. Yes, it can.
Right.
And so as a result of that, we're in a mode where in the authorizing resolution, we have a not to exceed amount. Yeah. And so that is what it cannot go above. And that's how we set this up. When I say we, but bond counsel sets this up. At the end of the day, should rates shoot up beyond that, then typically what happens, and we saw this when the financial crisis has occurred back in 2009, 2010, the bond issue basically is halted. It is basically, suspended. It's happened several times. Hopefully, things get more, if we want to call it, settled back down. That's happened, and then typically come back in when things look better. Doesn't always happen, but by and large, give it some time. That's the way history has been. Again, anything can happen. The world is highly volatile, as you know, but at least for the moment, while the Fed is raising interest rates, there seems to be a general settling in, at least at this rough interest rate that we're finding. So the other reason that we wanted to start with this page and give this to council and to the citizens is that, as I indicated, you can see there, there is a modest jump in the debt service, and that is something that's already been built into your overall debt structure. It's been built into the cash flows and for the future plans. But what is, for us, as we've talked about, a real challenge is what has been identified as potential borrowing needs over the next several years. So with that said, wanted to make sure everybody understood that this really is the beginning of a series of needs based upon the fact that we talked about the city has identified over time considerable capital needs by virtue of it being so historic, by having aging infrastructure, those various things, as well as, of course, the requirements that both the federal and the state put on you with regard to water and sewer compliance. So, with all of that said, what you have right now in your 5-year approved capital improvement program, fiscal years 23 to 27, contemplates nearly $200 million of new additional debt for the system. And then on top of that, prior to that, there had been another $230+ million of bonds that have been authorized but unissued. So all total, there has been literally $400 million of needs at one time identified for taking care of the system. Now, let me show you what that basically means. If you look at just the $165 million, that is effectively, over the next several years, a doubling of the debt service from 11 million to some 20 million. Again, we've made some assumptions and those numbers can move around, but I think the important thing, and you've seen me before here, it's the order of magnitude. It's the idea that we're talking about significant pressure on the enterprise fund. And from our perspective, it's not sustainable, it's not reality. And so one of the things that we are going to talk about and recommend is that a complete overview of the system is done in terms of the needs and the timing and the urgency of these various things. At the same time, we know the state has been talking about programs that are intended to help a variety of communities with regard to dollars. Who knows if any of that's going to be a reality? I'm a little bit skeptical at this point, but we'll see. But at the same time, I think we have to just rely on what we know. And that is, if we, the city, have to absorb all of this, we have to figure out a way to make it work that doesn't make those rate increases unpalatable. So, with that said, for the moment, we have looked at revenue collections, and they were clearly challenged during the pandemic, and they made things extra hard. We need to be sure that we have sustainable and financially responsible water and utility system, and that we have those strong collection practices. In addition, we want to make sure that we continue to do that so that we can meet our bond covenants, which we have been doing, and we've demonstrated to VRA that with this borrowing, we continue to meet our bond covenants. But at the same time, we also know that there is this catch-up. And Kyle and I have used that term catch-up here, but we also know that ARPA monies are out there and available. And we realize that they are usable for water and sewer, and that is something that we realize that the city will want to consider in a strong way, especially as it relates to some of those most essential needs that your staff ultimately says have got to be done. From our perspective, for every dollar of ARPA that you could use, it's one less dollar you have to borrow, and it's one less dollar that puts pressure on debt service that makes the overall cash flows of the system that much more difficult. So again, that's really not our call, of course. No one's elected me, as you know. You're the elected folks. But if we can use ARPA for that, we'll call it that next tranche of needs, or a lot of those next tranche, that certainly is a very important potential help. It's not a cure-all, but it's another positive. So with that, I wanted to just give you a little bit of our thinking schedule-wise to do all of this. As we said, the bond sale on or about October 25th. The balance of the calendar year of 22, which will be essentially here before we know it, and early 23 as we get into the deliberations for the 24 fiscal year budget, is to consider a few things. Number one, of course, to also close on that $5 million revolving fund loan, but then also to work with the staff and ourselves to the extent you're willing to, and to truly try to define what are the absolute needs and the timing and the magnitude of those absolute needs, the things that you have no choice but to do, and to also compare those needs and dollars and timing with, for example, what type of ARPA dollars we're talking about. And if we can do that, then we can say, fine, what's the difference? What is the divide between the ARPA dollars, the dollars we've just raised, and the absolute must-haves over the next couple of years. At that point, we're in a mode to give you what we've done before to this council in work sessions and other times, is to say, we estimate that there'll be rate impacts of X, Y, or Z over the next several years based upon all that. It's just our feeling that with $400 million that has come over multiple years, a lot of these things are probably not applicable anymore. They may be more than that, maybe less than that, but it's difficult for us to know. And with all of the changes in personnel and what have you, utility-wise, I think it's our recommendation as your advisor that a fresh outside look be taken that says, okay, this is what needs to be done and when, that is a must-haves for you. At the same time, there may be certain things that you identify as a council that are economic development driven that require some needs as it relates to funding. That also will be important, because to the extent, for example, that there's a project, I'm just picking a number here, no specific project, that let's say requires $15 million of utility needs. But that project, by virtue of doing 15 million, can produce several million dollars annually of recurring new tax revenues. That's something we can make work. That's something that we can do that actually can reduce the burden on the overall citizens, even if it's raising new debt, because it's really an investment versus a cost. So from that perspective, that's really what we wanted to say. Kyle, is there anything you have added? Just curious, do you know in the authorizing resolution what the not to exceed is? 550. I didn't want to speculate. It's 550, Mayor. Okay? So like I said, it could go above 5%. So, okay. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions from y'all. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Dr. Whitaker, sir, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Rose, for the presentation. Couple of questions. You mentioned the ARPA funding and the impact that could possibly have as far as reducing the need to borrow.
Yes, sir.
What about, has staff looked at the infrastructure money in regards to any of these projects?
I can't speak to that,
Right,
but
that's what I was asking.
Are you I'm sorry, good evening, Dr. Whitaker. Are you referring to the infrastructure bill?
Right.
Yes, we have, we have applied for funding for the infrastructure bill, and again, we are still waiting on the approval, or if any, because that is a competitive process. So we don't have a specific dollar amount as
Right.
to what they have approved or will approve for us.
Right, so any of the projects that are anticipated as far as being used with the bond issue, are any of those connected to any application for the infrastructure funding?
Not for utilities, to my
Okay.
understanding. I don't see Mr. Wright, but I know he will be here later on because he is the one who spearheads that application. But
Okay.
it is, we have identified projects, not so specific to utilities, but
Okay.
for the general government projects we have.
Okay, and Mr. Rose, this question,
yes, sir.
I think it's for you. When you mentioned on page 3, when you mentioned that of this 25 million, 10 million of it is being used to reimburse. And so these projects that are on page 13, these projects, the city has already expended funds and paid.
That's right.
So how will this 10 million be used then? Because that's purely basically a paper transaction.
I
As
can
far,
answer that.
because those funds, there aren't vendors waiting to be paid. They've already been paid.
So let me answer that if
Okay.
you want, Mimi. So Dr. Whitaker, If you may recall, when we talk about, let's say, having a certain amount of fund balance in the general fund,
Right.
we like to have a certain amount to help pay bills and to have a sort of a reserve, if you would. Well, we have the same thing in the enterprise fund, and we try to shoot for a certain amount of dollars, if you would, to always have to take care of bills, to take care of operations, to also, if something terrible does happen and we have a standstill or a stoppage, we have enough dollars. So what happened is we basically went and spent down some 10 million, if you would, of those dollars in our reserve fund. And now, from good management practice, it's time to put the 10 million back to our utility enterprise reserve fund. So we actually have a separate reserve fund for the enterprise fund, so that, again, we don't have to do short-term borrowing to take care of bills, and that we also don't have to slow down making payments, things like that. But we do want to keep a certain amount of dollars, a well-run system, just like we have that certain covenants that VRA wants us to have. They also want to make sure that we have a certain amount of days cash on hand. It's no different than you and I, let's say, hopefully trying to have, go with me, let's say a month's cash on hand annually, in case there's some problems or a job is lost or something like that. So it's the same thing.
Right. So does this have anything to do with making sure we are not over our policy that
This
dictates
is-
how funds are used?
So we basically have sort of unofficial sort of policy levels as it relates to how we look at cash management with regard to utility enterprise funds. And so from our perspective, to make sure it's sort of a healthy balance, it's time we've spent it down purposely. Again, the goal here, and I think you know this as well, it takes a lot to do a bond issue. There's a whole lot of work on a whole lot of people's behalf. So we try not to go to the market every few months. We like to go once a year, maybe once every couple years or what have you. So the idea is we say, fine, how long can we go till we have to borrow? And so our feeling was, well, we have additional new money needs and we've spent some money down. Now let's come together and do this bond issue. So that's how we've done it.
My last question then, if this is a reimbursement and it is sitting there as an emergency, if those funds are expended, will that take us over the policy that we usually use to determine whether we spend or not?
I think, you're good, maybe if you want.
Just as a quick summary, I think I know what you're asking. So when the council authorizes the projects, you're authorizing us to do projects. So with that being said, we start a project. Those projects get started, and what this reimbursement does, it puts money back in cash flow. So we start the project, we get the project, you approve the project, council, we start the project, it starts moving. Then you have already said, now Mimi, go after bond sales so that we can push money back into the system. Because again, as you're spending down our fund balance for utilities. So now we're trying to get that money back so we can continue, because again, the 25 million is not going to cover every project we have. We have to keep money flowing, but it gives us the authority to go in, spend those dollars on authorized projects, put the money back into cash flow so we can do even more projects. Is that fair?
Yeah, right, because I didn't want to give citizens the impression, because we get all the time, we hear all the time about issues with utilities, and they're legitimate. And if we're sitting on $10 million that can be used to further, and we're not jeopardizing the fund or violating the policy, that's what I was more concerned about.
Right, because we're not really sitting on $10 million. We're taking that $10 million and we're funneling it back into the system so that we can continue the projects that have already been approved by council.
Right, because when you hear words like it's an emergency fund, and persons are saying, well, we're in an emergency now, flooding and so forth, so that's what I wanted to get.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Rose, I do have a couple of questions.
Yes, sir.
My first question is, you know, the 400 million certainly is a large number, and I'm kind of sensitive to, you know, getting more debt. I'm also sensitive to the fact that we just saw recently in one of our cities in the United States, Jackson, Mississippi, where they had a situation with their water system. I'm sure you were aware of that.
Very much.
And so I think for at least me, it causes me to not feel real comfortable. My question is simply not necessarily to you, but to our city. I understand, you know, what the implications are, because we have to continuously put into this fund, and we have to continuously improve our infrastructure. And I'm certainly aware of that. But I know that, and this is for the city manager, I know in the past we have had some challenges. As Mr. Rose stated, one of the important components of making sure that we are managing our resources appropriately is our collections, right? And so I know previously we had an issue with collections, and perhaps that's historical, and that is just one area I think where we possibly can improve, which will keep us more on track with making our payments on time, perhaps. Are we improving in that area? What is going on in terms of that? Because I know we were in arrears several millions of dollars.
Yes, sir. And as we spoke previously, you know, we were in arrears several millions of dollars. Probably half of that has been collected, but we are looking forward to partnering with a collection agency to get, you know, additional revenues collected. Unfortunately, due to COVID, we had the policy that we weren't, you know, shutting off
Understood.
water, so it extended the revenue and the debt. But we are working as a city to work on that debt collection.
So just so I'm clear, there will be a process in place to recoup those funds, and going forward, there's going to be a better management of watching, you know, those funds as we go forward.
That's the plan, sir.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Moody, sir, you have the floor.
Well, to follow up on that, I don't think those delinquent debts occurred as a result of COVID by themselves. I think it was because of no collection policy in place. We were trying to do that in-house. Is that correct?
Good evening, Councilman Moody. I just wanted to respond. Yes, we have identified some additional needs in utilities as far as the collection process is there, as well as some other priorities that we want to put ahead, will move forward with utilities, along with the billing process, or should I say the billing cycle. We're looking at that to increase the receivables for the utility department. We are looking at some additional collection efforts. As city manager did mention, that we are working with the collection agency that city treasurer has in collection of the taxes. We're just seeing some opportunities missed, so we've identified those, and we're moving forward with trying to get those recommendations done.
Well, this council's been aware for some time that especially in the utility arena, that figure was quite substantial to the point of $14 million. So where do we stand on that? What percentage of that has been collected since we were made aware of that? Probably about four or 5 months ago, maybe longer.
Unfortunately, I don't have that figure right in front of me to be able to give you that. But I do know they have made some efforts and strides, but I don't have an exact figure because, again, we had ARPA dollars to offset some of the delinquencies with public utilities, but again, it didn't absorb it all, but we did have some. And then we also have another ARPA opportunity that just came through for about $47,000. I can't say off the top, but it was to allow us some additional assistance with delinquencies.
Now, we're not using that ARPA money to, for commercial delinquencies, are we?
No, sir. It's been identified for more residential. The need is stronger or heavier in the residential section than commercial.
What percentage of that 14 was commercial versus residential?
I promise I don't know off the top of my head. Usually I can give you that, but I was not prepared for that tonight.
I think it would be good to know
As a
what
report back.
percentage is commercial and what percentage, usually actuaries will say a percentage, and usually that percentage is pretty substantial. More than likely, you won't collect it. You know, as the mayor pointed out, that's money that could be working for us versus accruing additional debt, as you know. But that would be good information as to what percentage and dollar amount is in the commercial sector.
Yes, sir.
Thanks.
Mr. Battle, sir, you have the floor.
A couple of years ago, we pulled a bond.
I'm sorry.
A couple of years ago, we pulled a bond, correct?
When you say,
Utilities bond,
I'm not sure I recall.
30 million. Did we pull a bond 30 million a couple of years ago?
Your terminology pulled, what do you mean by that?
Did we get funding?
Oh, to
funding?
borrow?
Yes.
Yes, we've done, over the years, we've
Yeah,
had any number of borrowings.
systematically, we've been
Yes,
doing that
sir.
over the
Yes, sir.
years.
Yes, sir, yes. I didn't know what you meant by that.
I remember when I first got on the council, there was a problem with the water system somewhere else in the country, and it made it look real bad. And you guys came before us and you said, now is the time because the interest rate is so low and it's at our benefit to go ahead and get this and get things done. And I understand that we have, which is my concern, not the whole United States, that we have an old system. And I don't understand the potential of it breaking down to the point that it puts us in an awful position. But I'm going to find that out. But when we got the bond at a meeting, our CFO said, well, we also spent 40 million with the 30. Did you?
Good evening, Council.
The last bond we got, I was talking about it and we voted on it and I asked questions. And you said not only that, we spent 40 more million with the 30.
You have a GO bond and you have a revenue bond.
I'm talking about funds. Total number of funds spent at that time. Okay, we'll satisfy this later. I'll get that straight. But I understand that we have a lot of problems, and I'm very conscious of us having a breakdown in water, and I always err on the side of caution with that. But I'm going to vote no against this, and I'm going to vote no because ever since I've been on the council, I've been asking for someone to put together a list that prioritizes our problems, let us know exactly what we need done, where, and that sort of thing. But to make a long story short, I haven't gotten that. So I know it's a bold move to take, but I think it's the right move to take until we get some information on that system. and how we can attack and improve, at best, the complete system, I'm going to stand down on this bond.
Thank you, sir. Councilwoman Lucas Burke, ma'am, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Mr. Rhodes, for the presentation. Good to see you and Kyle back with us again today. The information is, good information. It helps us to move in the direction that we need to make the best decision. As a member of the Virginia First Cities and attending the Virginia Municipal Leagues, some of the information that we received is to use our ARPA fund, of course, for things that come up like aging water systems. And I see that among all of the general revenue bonds and the general obligation bonds and the Virginia Resources Authority pooled borrowing program, there's a lot of funding out there in addition to the infrastructure bill that we will get through the grant that we applied for. But your recommendation to us is to try to use much of our ARPA fund to help fund some of these utility projects that we are in need of. So pretty much it's like getting a new bathroom and a shower as opposed to putting in a pool or a playground. I mean, it's something that you want for the children, but you know that you need this, and the best use of that fund would be what's needed to use money that is one-time money like the ARPA fund. So that's the scenario that I'm hearing from these conversations, and just want to make sure that I'm on the right track with
I
that.
think you're very much on the right track.
Yes, thank you, sir.
Dr. Whitaker, sir, you have the floor.
Yes, Mr. Rhodes, just make sure we're clear. So what is, I see the timeline here. So when will exactly the bond be available?
So typically what happens, Dr. Whitaker, if the bond issue is sold on or about October 25th, it's usually about 2 to 3 weeks later that the closing occurs. So let's say that'll probably be somewhere about November 15th, that time frame. I'm not saying that particular day, that might be a weekend for all I know, but basically sometime usually between Monday and Thursday of that week, we'll see a closing, and at such time, what will happen is VRA will then effectively transfer over those monies into the account of basically Portsmouth. Well, they'll set up an account. They set it up through, basically we have a special program at the state where the monies are immediately put in, they're safeguarded, they're managed basically by, they don't have to be, but they've typically been managed by through the state treasurer's office in a SNAP account, state non-arbitrage program. It's been around for 30 years now, and that money is reinvested immediately by the state. It's technically by private, but through the state. And that's what happens. So as you then make requisitions to draw that money down, it's available to you literally on 1 day's notice, 1 to 2 days' notice, that type of thing. So that's how it works.
Is that the 5 million you were speaking of, or the full 30?
So the 5 million is a little separate. So the 5 million is a revolving loan program funding. Kyle, you may know, when is that? Do you know when that's closing? Was that closed? Kyle's not sure exactly, but sort of later this calendar year. So basically, in an order of magnitude, sometime in the late fall, those $5 million will be available as well, Dr. Whitaker.
So the full amount is available?
Basically
By
sometime around the November, early December timeframe, probably. We could try to find out when that revolving loan pool is going to be.
And is the city paying interest on that once used or once it is available?
It pays interest once those proceeds are available to you. So what happens is you're not, between now and let's say November, you're going to get that revolving loan monies. You're not paying any interest on that. Also not paying any interest on the 25 million. But once the closing occurs, basically effectively, let's say November 15th, that's basically when the clock starts for the city. And we factored that in when we showed that debt schedules. We factored that in that kind of mode. What we did not do purposely, it's not going to make a big difference, But we have not assumed that when you take that in, you take that 25 million in a lump sum, what happens is you're paying on that lump sum, but you're also, to the extent that those 15 million that are going to be, in effect, used for future projects over a period of time, you're going to earn interest on those monies, because those monies are going to be sitting in your account. We don't factor that in. That's a positive that works to the city's advantage. We purposely don't count that.
So if that's the case, then if the interest starts immediately upon those funds, then what difference is it making whether you're using ARPA versus those funds? Because it's not like you're not
Good
paying
question,
interest.
because here's why. Because if you think of it this way, those funds, let's say whether it's 5 million or 25 million, we're going to owe that money over the next 20, 25, 30 years. We're going to pay the interest on that. With regard to the ARPA dollars, if we can use those dollars, then we don't have to borrow a like amount and don't have to pay the interest on those like amount of dollars for 10, 20, whatever the number of years we're going to repay that debt on, if that makes sense.
Well,
So
if you,
think of it
if you're
this way.
already, if you're already paying interest once those funds are, I say, deposited or made available, then
You only won't get the interest on it until you actually use those monies. That's
Okay,
what I'm
well,
saying, yeah.
so on November, because you said when it closes, the
Right.
interest starts.
Yes, sir.
So if it closes and the city doesn't draw down, let's say the city draws down 5 million in January. So does the city start paying interest on November 15th or on the 5 million?
So what
due down in
happens is you're
January?
going to pay interest on all of it, okay? But let's assume you don't draw down, as you say, 20 million of it till January. So between November and January, you will actually be earning interest on that $20 million. That $20 million, the interest you'll earn may not be exactly the same as the borrowing rate. We'll only find that out in a few months. What has happened, though, is short-term rates have come up quite a bit. So it's very possible that the difference between your long-term borrowing rate that I talked to you earlier about being around 4%, the short-term rates in around the 3%. So the difference in real cost for that couple of months is very nominal. It's basically effectively 1%. But we'll only know that come November. And then on top of that, that earnings that you can have, that can change. That can go up, it can go down. So it's not the type of thing, that's why we don't count on it to the extent that we bring in some extra dollars, because it takes you several months to sort of pay for that. That's a good thing, but we'd rather be conservative. We'd rather not count the chickens before they hatch, so to speak. That's how we look at it. Okay.
Any other questions from my colleagues on council? Seeing none, Mr. Rose, thank you for your presentation,
Thank you,
sir.
Councilman.
And also,
Thank
I
you.
want to thank the city staff on behalf of council for all of your work and putting this information together. Madam City Manager.
Thank you,
You have
Mr.
the floor.
Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Rose. Our next presentation, a brief presentation, will be by the Interim Director, Will Morris, and Mr. Timothy Dubois, to provide a short presentation on mosquito spraying, street sweeping, and the ditch maintenance schedules.
Okay, good evening, Mayor, Vice Mayor, City Manager, members of council. We appreciate the opportunity to share some information about what we do and what our dedicated workers can perform. My name is William Morris. I'm currently the interim department head for Public Works. I've been with the city for over 10 years, first with Public Utilities and now fortunate enough to lead Public Works. It is truly a great honor to serve my hometown. The Department of Public Works is comprised of 3 divisions: stormwater maintenance, mosquito control, and streets and highways. The street sweeper group falls under stormwater operations. These divisions function collectively to provide direct support to multiple city departments and our citizens by maintaining city-owned stormwater infrastructure, public streets, and sidewalks. All divisions are essential and report for severe weather events such as flooding, hurricanes, and snow. We currently have 43 full-time employees. I would like to introduce at this time our leadership team. We have two great assistant directors. First is Mr. Russell Stevens, if he could stand up. That's my buddy. In the operations lead role, he has over 30 years of experience with municipality utilities operations and has been a great asset to our department. Next is Mr. Tim Dubois. There he is. He is our lead administrator and our mosquito control professional. He has over 20 years of municipal experience treating mosquitoes and is a former president of the Virginia Mosquito Control Association. And now I will hand it over to Mr. Dubois.
Good evening. Tonight I'll be going over a brief overview of our program, but focusing on truck spraying and aerial spraying operations. First up, as a brief overview of our program, there are many different elements that make up the Mosquito Control Division. Outreach and education are important to engage the citizens and let them know what services the city provides. We work with other departments to remove sources of mosquito breeding, such as old tires that have been discarded into the woods, and eliminating trash in areas accessible to the team. Surveillance operations are really the key to the whole program. We set traps throughout the city on a weekly basis. These traps give us an idea of the types of mosquitoes that there are in the area and what the population levels are at that time. From the data collected, we are able to determine if additional control is needed. We'll be focusing tonight's presentation on the last two that you see under the program. These are the truck-mounted operations, our cooperation with the Army Corps of Engineers at Craney Island, and our cooperation with the Air Force Reserve Unit. First up is the truck-mounted larviciding. This is the primary way of controlling mosquito population levels. This method targets juvenile mosquitoes that breed in standing water and eliminates them before they become adult mosquitoes. The focus of this treatment method is roadside ditches, catch basins, and other areas accessible to the roadway. Treatments typically last about 30 days, so treatments are done every month when possible. Other public areas and right-of-ways, such as parks, back ditches, are inspected by the team throughout the season and treated when necessary. If the previous treatment method does not work, we have 4 trucks outfitted with sprayers. The city is divided into 9 different areas, which can all be sprayed within 3 nights if needed. Weather plays a huge role into the ability to spray. So rain, temperature is either too hot or too cold, and wind over 15 miles per hour can prevent truck fogging operations. The trucks are equipped with GPS tracking, which is needed to stay compliant with state and federal regulations. We have also increased our awareness with hobby beekeepers, which have increased dramatically over the last few years. Despite this being the most widely known form of control, truck-mounted operations are a last resort and are not the primary method of controlling mosquitoes. This is a snapshot of the tracking software that we have in the mosquito trucks. This software is designed to give us data on acreage sprayed and can be used to answer questions from citizens on if the area was sprayed, how fast the truck was driving, or other data that's used to comply with state and federal regulations. On to Craney Island. The city has a fantastic relationship with the Army Corps of Engineers, and we work together to make sure that conditions on Craney Island do not produce mosquito issues for the surrounding areas when possible. We currently do weekly inspections on the island to determine if the conditions warrant treatment. These conditions, when combined with weather data and surveillance collections, give us a snapshot of what to expect from there when we can work on getting treatment done before mosquitoes hatch off and cause disruptions in neighborhoods surrounding the area. When it comes to treatments done by plane, there are 2 different options utilized when necessary. First, the Army Corps of Engineers has a contractor that is able to do both juvenile and adult control. Similar to truck-mounted spraying operations, weather plays a huge role into the possibility of treatment. Rain, temperatures, and wind can delay or cancel a treatment window. Additionally, the Air Force Reserve Unit, based out of Youngstown, Ohio, has the option to spray, training their staff up to twice a year. Spray dates have to be made well in advance, but typically those are the last weeks of July and again the last week in August. These dates are picked based off of historical data that show that the mosquitoes are typically in higher populations at that time. This treatment is made by a C-130. It's a very large plane that flies very low to the ground and is done after sundown to maximize the control of mosquitoes as well as greatly reducing the effects of any non-target insects. I wanted to show this slide as well with recent issues over at Churchland. This shows data from the past 4 years that I have worked for the city of Portsmouth. The black line shows the average number of mosquitoes caught each week at the landfill, and the red line shows this year. The other lines show the corresponding years, and what I wanted to touch on was everything that this program works on, their relationship with the Army Corps of Engineers, increased surveillance, larvicide efforts during the day, all show that we are working to reduce big issues. While we may have a spike in the mosquito population levels due to weather conditions preventing treatment, our methods on controlling these mosquitoes are working. And this next slide is actually pretty much the same slide except for it's citywide. So you can actually see that we do have spikes. There was 2 spikes, one in, I believe, early July and then one in early August. And what it boils down to is weather affecting our ability to do treatment. As for public notification, the mosquito control hotline is updated if spraying is scheduled. The city will put out press releases posted on the city's website as well as city's social media. Most local news stations will actually run the release on their websites if treatment is done by plane. And beekeepers are notified by phone at least 24 hours in advance of a treatment done by plane. Lastly, the Army Corps of Engineers website also runs press releases for any treatment done on or over Craney Island. And with that, I'll switch it back over to Will to go over street sweeping and ditch maintenance.
Thank you, Tim. The street sweepers clean and remove debris from city streets to reduce the material that enters the stormwater infrastructure and surrounding river. This function is a requirement of the Department of Environmental Quality DEQ stormwater discharge permit. Here is the schedule that we publish in advance to let citizens know when we will be in their neighborhood. November to March is our reduced schedule, mainly due to weather and the amount of foliage needed to be collected. This schedule is published on every social media outlet that the city is affiliated with. The schedule is also sent out via city webmail. It can also be viewed anytime on the city website. Here we show the amount in tons of debris and trash that do not reach the storm drain system and ultimately does not reach the Elizabeth River. Scale-wise, 2,000 tons is 4 million pounds or 100 tandem dump truck loads of material. Since the scales became operational in 2019, we have prevented over 17 million pounds of material from polluting the Elizabeth River. Our scheduling allows us to hit most every street in Portsmouth 3 times a year between April and October. Ditch crews maintain the city's stormwater infrastructure to provide a drainage and minimize flooding. This includes ditches, catch basins, drop inlets, outfalls, manholes, and best management practices B&Ps. This division also inspects and provides temporary repairs on cave-ins pending contractual repair. While we are still very reactionary to citizen concerns and complaints, we are striving and moving towards a preventative maintenance schedule. Storms can often impact our scheduling. The picture you see here is the same ditch on a before and after shot. Our workers do a very excellent job day in and day out. Lastly, if you have any questions, please let us know, and thank you for your time this afternoon.
Thank you, sir, for a thorough presentation. Councilman Moody, sir, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mayor. Great presentation, and thank you for what y'all do. That's the type of job that sometimes thankless, especially in the summer when the mosquitoes are attacking. But all in all, I think this was a fairly good summer.
Okay, thank you.
With that said, we have a lot of ditches in our city, and those many of those breed mosquitoes. How often are they typically larvicide?
So if you're referring to roadside ditches, those are done once a month. Those are part of the larviciding operations. If we can reach it from the truck, we can actually hit it once a month. As far as the back and side ditches, they're a little trickier. Our operations will go out there and inspect, or if we get complaints from a citizen about the ditches breeding mosquitoes, we'll actually go out there and inspect and treat. So those are a little trickier, but the treatment method for the back ditches, we can actually use a different type of pesticide that lasts a lot longer. So for the back ditches and side ditches, that treatment can last up to 130 days.
Right. When on the hotline, when a citizen calls the hotline, what kind of action can they expect as a result of that?
So the hotline is for informational purposes only when we're spraying with the trucks or the airplane. If you want to log a complaint about mosquitoes, it would just be our Public Works number, 393-8666, and then log a complaint that way, or use the city's website for logging a 311 complaint.
So the hotline just provides like a spraying schedule of the next aerial spraying?
Aerials are kind of hit and miss. They're a lot less active than the truck fogging. So 9 times out of 10, if you call the hotline, it's more about truck fogging operations.
Right.
When we do have to pull the trigger on an airplane, that information will be up there as well.
On our contracted aerial spraying, not the Air Force, but on the contracting, how many flights, what determines how many we have each year? Is that a set number we go into, or is it based off the data from the previous year?
Just for informational purposes, the contract with the aerial spraying is through Craney Island or through the Army Corps of Engineers. We do actually get some treatment off of that because we kind of use that contract to get the plane to fly over parts of Churchland as well, because it would not work very well if you just sprayed the island and not the surrounding neighborhoods. It would actually have a worse effect. But that said, there's no set number of airplane treatments that are done, and they're not based on a schedule. They're more based off of what we're actually seeing on the island.
Right. But they pay for that, or is that a joint?
It's a joint effort.
Okay. Thanks. Once again, thanks for the job that y'all do.
Not a problem.
Thank you again, gentlemen. Are there any other questions or concerns? Councilman Woodard, sir, you have the floor.
Thank you. Appreciate everything you do, Mr. Will. Nice presentation. I got a question and this comes from the Park View residents. They said they have a lot of concerns with an increased mosquito presence over there. It's a lot of bracket water in between the creek between West Park View and Shade Terrace area, and they was trying to see is their neighborhood in consideration of, I guess, aerial sprays?
Yeah, so I don't, off the top of my head, which, yeah, go ahead, Tim. He's my mosquito professional.
So as far as aerial treatment is concerned, that's not really something that the city actually has done. We use the contractor that does Craney Island to spray the surrounding areas, mostly the Churchland area around it, and then the federal properties around that as well. And that will affect that whole area. As far as on the south side, the area that you're concerned with, if there is an issue, by all means, please call us and let us know, and we'll go out there and investigate. I know that area very well. There's a lot of issues with illegal dumping out there in that area. If we can get to a spot and clean it up, that's kind of what we're designed for. But a lot of times it's private property, and we don't go on private property.
Right. I guess the concerns I got was from most of the citizens that live near the water.
Yes.
They were saying there was just an increase in presence from mosquitoes. So I understand you're saying there's dumping over there as well. But is there any other additional treatments that we can do for the citizens that's around that area, around that bank area?
Yeah, I mean, if there's an issue, absolutely call in and we can investigate. We have traps actually out in that area, and we trap on a weekly basis just to make sure that the numbers aren't going crazy. If there is an issue, we would absolutely send out the trucks. But a lot of times, if we don't see an increase in numbers in our surveillance and we don't have anybody calling in, then that's not something that we would see. And so the treatment is, reduced at that point.
Well, for City Manager Chapman, is that something that we can follow up on just to get some people out there and see what, the data is looking like with the mosquitoes?
Yes, sir. It sounds like they're already doing it. They're monitoring it
Yeah,
now.
we'll definitely take a look at it. It'll be something we'll look at this week.
Okay, appreciate you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Dr. Whitaker, sir, you have the floor.
Just a quick question for Mr. Morris. When you mentioned that in 2019 the scales became operational, which scales were you referring to?
The scales at the landfill?
So at Craney Island?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Okay. So the Craney Island scale is working now?
To my knowledge, it
Okay.
is working, yeah.
All right.
So like, when our vac trucks, they'll dump on our new decant pad at the operations facility.
Mm-hmm.
We let it dry out, we collect it, take it down to the landfill. They weigh it on a roll-off truck, basically. And we take credit for all of that. Those tonnage goes into our annual stormwater permit
Okay. All right.
report.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Councilwoman Lucas Burke, ma'am, you have the floor.
Great, thank you, Mayor. Thank you for the presentation.
Yes, ma'am.
Just one quick question about the beekeepers in the Churchill area. You're tracking them. When people move to the area, if they're going to be a beekeeper person, do they call you and let you know and get on a list? And then for the communities like Parkview and Cavalier Manor and some of the other crowd out where the trucks go, does that larvicide affect any beekeepers who might be in that area?
So we, at the start of every year, we put out a notice via the website, our newsletter, any way possible to get beekeepers to actually call us and inform us where the hives are.
Mm-hmm.
And that just basically gives us an idea of where they are in the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
The truck spraying that we do would affect the bees, but that's why we spray at night.
Okay.
It's actually very effective because it's the most active that mosquitoes are, but it's also the least active when the bees are.
Okay.
So it works out really well. We do tell them we'll shut off the sprayer when we get near them. That way it's just a double safe for us to make sure that there are no issues.
Yeah.
We have had a few beekeepers that come in the area and they are knowledgeable enough to reach out and say, hey, I'm a new beekeeper. In the middle of the season, it's kind of hard to constantly reach out to them to see. There are probably, I would say, about 30 different beekeepers in the area, and there's probably more than that, but that's what we know of.
Right, okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Madam City Manager, thank you guys for your presentation. We appreciate you, and keep up the great work. Thank you, sirs.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Mayor, I just have one more item to update council on. It's in reference to an unfinished business item, which is 302 Quebec Street. PRHA acquired the property in 2005 and until recently leased the home for residential occupancy. The property is currently vacant and PRHA has expressed a willingness to deed the property to the city as a gift. No purchase price will be paid for the acquisition. The acquisition of the property furthers the interests of the stormwater and flood mitigation programs by preventing development in the flood hazard area. The city will pay for demolition of the structure, and that concludes our presentations.
Before we open it up for questions, I'd like to provide some additional background information on this particular area and property. Several years ago, city-affiliated entities, including PPIC and PRHA, acquired a number of properties in the Sugar Hill section of Portsmouth. PRHA acquired 320 Quebec Street at a tax sale in 2005. While the acquisitions were originally made with an eye toward potential development in the area, it was ultimately determined by the city that the development was not desirable because Sugar Hill area is too low-lying and has too many flooding concerns. At the request of City Council in 2013, PPIC conveyed all of its properties in the Sugar Hill to the City of Portsmouth. The 320 Quebec Street property has a home on it, and until recently, as you said, it was residential. But I just wanted to share with everyone the history over there and what has been determined. It is a low-lying area that is significantly prone to flood hazards, and so I will now open the floor up for questions, sir. Dr. Whitaker, you have the floor.
Right. Yeah, the history that you shared just then, I think council received that email with that information previously a few weeks ago.
I share that because sometimes everyone doesn't review the backup documentation, so I just wanted to let everyone know what it is.
Right.
Thank you, sir.
My concern with this property is several-fold. First of all, why would it be in the city's interest to reacquire Quebec Street property? And why would the city want to incur the demolition costs when PRHA can incur that cost? So why would we want the property transferred back to us for the city to demolish it when PRHA can do that as an entity itself? That's one concern. My second issue with this has been the concern that I have raised from the beginning, and some of this information is presented here in this Quebec Street report, and some of it was just mentioned in the history. And my concern, which still has not actually been directly addressed, is that in what the mayor just read, those properties were acquired with the intent of possibly developing that property commercially, industrially. What's problematic with this is that when I look at this report on Quebec Street and the Sugar Hill community, which was a historic African-American community, and I see that the city has aggressively owned 85% of the properties. When I look here on page 12, and the city currently says current ownership, Portsmouth 74, PRHA 1, 87 total. So 85% of it is owned by Portsmouth. And we see this aggressiveness as far as acquiring these properties. And then we see on page 14 that these properties were acquired substantially through special commissioner actions. I do have a question for our assessor, because in the report it has transfer instrument type unknown. And
Mr. Dorr, sir, would you come forward, please?
and then it has special receiver 7. For the 11 properties that you have listed here as instrument unknown, I don't understand. So are these properties that the city owns?
Yes, sir, they currently own these properties. However, I could not determine the deed in which they were acquired.
So for 11 of those properties that the city saw fit to possibly develop industrially, we don't even know how the city acquired the properties?
That is correct from my point of view, yes, sir.
Okay, and so no documents show how that was done?
Right, in some cases, the deed book reference does not match up. It's just in the city's name currently, no deed book reference to it, or it's mistitled, so the deed book doesn't lead me to that property, it leads to another property.
Right. And then you make a note here on page 15 that in comparable properties or neighborhoods such as Shea Terrace, Port Norfolk, Prentice Park, that you don't see this aggressive use of special commissioner sales.
That is correct.
But for Sugar Hill, there was this aggressive use of acquiring these properties from these African-American residents using the special commissioner cell.
Yes, sir.
Okay, yeah, see, I have a problem with that, and that's why I raised it earlier, that it appears that there's some inequity in how those properties were acquired. And what it looks as if is that the city, and probably with some developers, because it said for industrial development, thought that they could develop that property. And so they used these aggressive instruments and acquired them from some low-income African Americans, take their property, find out we can't develop it, and now you want to give it back to the city. I have a problem with that. And I don't, you know, I see some significant equity issues there. And I know historically that there have been African American neighborhoods around this country
Yes, sir.
in which properties were acquired through aggressive means such as this. And I'm not going to sit silent and act as if this isn't happening here or has
Right.
not. Because if you can't explain how the city is in ownership of properties and there's no documentation of that, then how are we to conclude that it was taken properly? Okay,
That's a good question.
So
This raises many more questions than
I'm not in
answers.
favor of trying to transfer this property back to the city. First of all, for the city to demolish it, which PRHA could do itself. But then secondly, to sort of wash this thing away. Because if this hadn't come up and if that wording hadn't been like it was, because most persons who read this, I didn't even hear any persons from the community raise an issue about this because it's glossed over in the language. And so I'm not in favor of this being transferred back to the city. And I would like for, if there's no objection from council, for our city attorney to look further into this issue beyond just the city assessor and looking at the inequity that took place and how these properties that were owned by persons who I know were struggling, persons who were trying to make ends meet, and those properties were taken, therefore denying them generational wealth transfers. And I'm not going to just sit here and act like I don't see it. And I encourage my colleagues not to vote for this transfer back to the city.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Madam City Attorney, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, Your Honor, Your Honor, no, Chair, I'd be more than happy to assist in finding that information with the consent of council. And if you want to just do a quick show of hands or whatever, I'd be more than happy to do that.
If you want to do additional research, sure.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Councilwoman Lucasberg.
Yes, thank you. The 320 Quebec Street, are these on page, I can't see, page 13, are these the other properties that make up this community? I mean, this is still a community that is intact even though low-lying flooding occurs? Are there other homes in this community?
Mr. Barwin, can you address that concern,
Yes,
please?
thank you, Mayor. I believe there are approximately 11 homes left in the neighborhood,
Okay.
and the rest of the parcels are vacant.
Okay, all right.
Dr. Whitaker, you have the floor, sir.
The flooding issue, how was that determined that there's flooding in that area and therefore using that as a justification now to transfer it back and saying no development can take place? How was that
Would you
determined?
please come to speak to the group, please? Thank you, sir.
Good evening. This property has been mapped by the FEMA flood maps as being in flood zone, entirely in the flood zone. In addition, the property is located within the city's Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act resource protection area.
So just,
So it's mapped and it's a flood zone property. It's regulated as such, and it's Ches Bay property in a RPA. It's regulated as such.
so it's just that property that's in a flood zone?
No, there are others in the neighborhood. They're also in the flood zone.
Yeah, because I talked to longtime residents of Sugar Hill, and they said that as much hurricanes that come through there, that they don't remember it flooding that heavily. And so I'm very concerned. That's why I want the city attorney to really look more into this issue as far as how these, particularly, like I said, when I see 11 properties that you don't know how the city acquired those, I think that deserves more investigation.
I just got one more. Hold on.
Do you have a question for Mr. Baldwin, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And just make no mistake, it's other neighborhoods as well in Portsmouth that's in flood zones, right? But with the proper, with new development, you know, as long as you're in the guidelines, you can be in a flood zone, right?
Yes, generally speaking, there are pretty extensive guidelines for either developing or redeveloping in a flood zone. Obviously,
Higher
the goal-
foundations.
and exactly, could be higher foundations, could be new construction, be raising the lot, could be a number of things you could do. The problem you have in a situation like this is that the FEMA restrictions limit how much money you can put into rehabbing an older structure. And so I think this is a fairly sizable structure, and I think what you'd likely have is if PRHA has the property, and what we had seen them discussing for was selling it to a developer who would tear it down and come in to build a new house in that location.
Right, yeah, my question was pertaining to new developments.
Right, that's what someone would likely want to do there. What would happen is the cost of the renovations would exceed the FEMA
Absolutely.
guidelines to allow them to do that. And so most people, once they run up against that figure, will opt to demolish and then try to come back and build new.
And just one more question. Do you have any knowledge of any preparation to stop flooding in that area? Anything to do with, making the bank higher, adding additional dirt, gravel, just improve conditions in that area?
As far as I know, I'm not aware of any specific action been taken over there. It's right abutting the port property.
Right.
At Harper Drive there, so I'm not aware of any additional flood control measures for that neighborhood.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Baldwin. Appreciate you, Mr. Mayor.
Dr. Whitaker,
So,
sir, you have the
Mr.
floor.
Baldwin, my question again, so why is it that PRHA cannot demolish the property?
PRHA could demolish the property. What I was saying is, based on earlier, and this has been months ago now, conversation with PRHA, what they would likely do is sell it, as opposed to demolishing it themselves. They would likely sell it to a developer who would then come into.
Right, so they want the city to spend funds to demolish it, when they have funds to
Right.
demolish.
What the city would intend to do would be to tear it down and add it to our stormwater management
Right.
program.
Okay.
Mr. Battle, sir, you have the floor.
Are there any federal or state incentives to develop there?
Not for being in a flood zone, no. In fact, the federal rules are intended to stop you from developing in flood zones, so they're more restricted as opposed to encouraging.
And Mr. Baldwin, part of the rationale too is related to sea level rise, particularly in some of the flood zone areas.
Yes, over time,
Right.
that would become an issue, yes.
Right, and that can explain, over the years, there may not have been flooding, but with sea level rise and what we're experiencing, particularly in our region,
Right.
it could be a very real situation.
Right, certainly.
Yeah, and I that may be a scenario, but that tends to support what I'm saying, is that they acquired the properties thinking they could develop it. Then they find out they can't develop it, and now they want to get, and they've already given a significant number back to the city back in 2016, I believe. Okay, so they take these folks' property, thinking they can develop it, find out they can't now because of sea level issues, okay? And now they transfer them back to the city, but then it's this one last piece of property that they need to transfer back, and it raises more issues than just the transfer. And so I agree. I agree with what you just said. That probably is what happened.
Thank you, sir. Madam City Manager?
Mr. Mayor, the next item on the agenda is the city assessor's report.
Mayor Glover, Vice Mayor Barnes, members of council. I'd just like to give you a brief overview of the Office of the City Assessor at this point in time, where we are since I've been here for almost a year. What I'm going to do is just quickly go over the responsibility and an effort of time. I'll move through this fairly quickly and then slow down towards the end. I want to point out resources, staffing, and technology. Those are our two biggest elements. Staffing, we've been quite short in time. I'm going to skip over these parts real quick. This just talks about the legal authorities, assess everything at 100% of fair market value. This defines market value, what a willing buyer and seller will come to acquire a property. This is basically the mission statement for the office. Day-to-day functions, collection, inspecting properties, review and updating records, transfers, perform statistical analysis so we can value all the properties fairly and equitably throughout the city. Combinations and subdivisions of lots which occur all the time, and provide aid to citizens by providing them with the most current and up-to-date assessment values and records. Our resources, staffing level. When I got here, the staffing level was low. It's gotten even lower. At times, when I say 40%, it was actually 50%. Currently, we have a staff of 8, just because I brought on 2 new people the first part of August. Prior to that, we went through the reassessment cycle with 6 employees, and those existing and core set of employees are to be commended, bringing us one of the largest reassessments that have been driven by market conditions. The goals are to continue to build on the core foundation of our team with bolstered leadership and ability for I acquired leadership and professionals from surrounding jurisdictions. And I'm going to continue with the assessment, education, and credentials. We're on page 6. Going to page 7, resources. We're in the process of implementing the Vision CAMA software. CAMA, what's it stand for? Computer Assisted Mass Appraisal. It allows us to collect and maintain data and then statistically analyze it, drive a large volume of property value back. It's not a one individual appraisal. It's done on a mass basis, a whole group of properties. And that's why it's very important that we leverage technology. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to leverage and implement this new Vision CAMA system. The current system we have was probably written in the 70s, and I believe we acquired it in the 70s, or it was written in the 60s, and we acquired it in the 70s, and it served its purpose well, but it's a software program that was long out of date. We're supposed to have an update tonight, but apparently that's been delayed slightly. Staying on top of that, seeing if we get it, make sure it gets implemented. It's very important. Just to touch base on the residential property. We're primarily residential in the neighborhood. This is where we are. It gives us a median sale price, median assessment. The ASR, assessment to sale ratio, that's an important statistic to look at. These are the sales, the 2022 sales are all the sales from January to date. Well, you can still see our assessment to ratio is 82%, whether you're looking at the median or 84% at the average. You can also see what happened to the sale prices of properties last year. For example, the median sale price was $215,000. This year it's $235,000. The average was $222 and it's gone to $239. And just touch base on the median sale price increase from the prior year, almost 10% and almost 8% on an average basis. Emphasizing yet again what the assessment sale ratio was at the time of sale. We've come up some, and the goal is to be at 100% of market value. This is a taxable land book increase. This is going back to 2012. Remember the housing crisis, I've been through the savings and loan crisis, another housing bubble, occurred in 2012, and it impacted our economy and throughout the region pretty heavily. But you can see how we slowly climbed back up. In this past year, we had a tremendous growth due to the market conditions. Here's a property distribution of what we have. Residential property accounts for 42%. Exempt property accounts for 41%, commercial 12, industrial 5. Special focus and commitment needs to be looked at commercial and industrial properties. If I break out those assessment to sale ratios, they're bad. Questions and answers?
Dr. Whitaker, you have the floor, sir.
So, Mr. Doris, from a council perspective, as far as budgeting for your department, as far as technology and staffing, is the funding there to go on and take care of the necessary staffing needs and the technology needs?
Technology's funding's there. That was taken care of in the last budget cycle. Staffing issue, once I get staffed up, I can come back to you with a concrete answer on that. I suspect we're short, but we physically just don't have the space. We have space for 11 people in the office, and an office that, in my opinion, should be 13 to 14 people to provide our citizens with the proper services necessary and address our, in some cases, inequities in the valuation between residential and commercial properties.
Councilman Moody, sir, you have the floor.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mayor. A while back, I guess maybe 6, 7 months ago, doing a presentation, you had mentioned that the reason the commercial segment was down as far as increase was the lack of commercial appraisers.
Yes, sir.
How's that now?
We're in that same boat. They're not easy to come across. I've tried to find some people. I'm still diligently working on it, and we're eventually bringing staff in. As I mentioned, I brought in 2 strong people with over 30, 35 years experience combined between the 2 of them. That's the commercial aspect is something I'm still focusing on.
So pretty much at the same level you were then?
Right. You will see some change this year.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Doris, thank
Yes,
you
sir.
for your time, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Madam City Manager?
Mr. Mayor, members of council, I have several CMRs to go through. 22-157, the adoption of a resolution to acquire 320 Quebec Street. 22-258, the adoption of an ordinance to accept $537,999 for the expansion of and upgrade of the Body Works exhibit at the Children's Museum of Virginia. 22-259, adoption of an ordinance accepting $24,441 of Home and Investment Partnership Program for Community Planning Development Program Fund. 22-260, the adoption of an ordinance accepting Summer Food Service Program of $377,436.65 for the Department of Parks and Recs. 22-261, the adoption of an ordinance to accept $48,714 in municipal utility assistance program funds to assist eligible public utilities department customers who are in arrears due to COVID-19. 22-262, the adoption of an ordinance accepting assistance to firefighters grant in the amount of $286,562.34 to provide paramedic training to firefighters. 22-263, adoption of an ordinance authorizing the issuance of the sale of revenue bonds by the City of Portsmouth for the payment thereof of the water and sewer systems revenue bonds in a total not to exceed $27,700,700. 22-264, adoption of an ordinance creating a budgetary fund called the Portsmouth Broadband Authority Fund, appropriating the sum of $50,000 to the Portsmouth Broadband Authority Fund budget. 22-265, adoption of an ordinance to amend and reordain Article 1 of Chapter 35 of the Code of Portsmouth for taxation in general and for complying with state law in regards to disabled veterans' personal property tax exemption. 22-266, adoption of an ordinance to amend and reordain Article 10 of Chapter 35 for the Code of Portsmouth for transient rental tax for the purpose of complying with the amendments from the state code regarding the collection of transient rental tax by intermediaries. 22-267, adoption of ordinance accepting mental health general funds in the amount of $222,589 for the BHS mental health services. 22-268, the adoption of ordinance accepting $27,000 in residential support from the Virginia Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services for individuals diagnosed with intellectual and/or developmental disability. 22-269, adoption of ordinance accepting $19,052 in mental health block grant workforce initiative funds for the mental health services. 22-270, adoption of ordinance accepting $58,388 in projects for assistance in transition from homelessness, training and travel for BHS. 22-271, adoption of an ordinance accepting $78,765.20 in settlement funds from the National Opioids Settlement Fund Trust, and that will go to BHS as well. 22-272, adoption of a resolution certifying the City of Portsmouth support of an application for Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development Port Host Communities Grant in the amount of $415,657 for the revitalization of 16 Harper Avenue for port-related uses. Mr. Mayor, that concludes my report.
Thank you, ma'am. And we have now come to the agenda item on City Council liaison reports. Are there any City Council liaison reports at this time? Seeing none, then we do have a need for a closed session.
Mr. Mayor,
Yes, sir.
before, I just want to go back to our discussion on the public utilities, and believe with the city manager, I believe Ms. Terry was asked to provide us with the delinquencies breakdown on commercial versus residential. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. In addition to just the amount for commercial, can you also show it historically? That is, instead of just saying, giving us an amount, for example, commercial is $1 million, can you give us historically that breakdown for commercial? And also identify which commercial entities historically have been delinquent.
Ma'am, you have the floor.
So, so that I'm clear on the direction. Historically means, so if we have, say, a delinquency for a HOA, a association for development, or an association for a residential
Homeowners Association.
yeah, for a group, and they have historically been late, and so much so that they haven't paid the water bill, and the residents within that organization have had to come to the city and request assistance in moving their water bill delinquency forward so they could sell or buy their property, what have you. So if they've been late paying that water bill for the last 12 months, so are you looking for 2 years, 3 years, 12 months? Are you saying they just have been historically late? What is your time frame?
Well, when you're talking about delinquencies of $13 and $14 million, that doesn't just happen in a day. Okay? So I'm curious as to, are there some entities in the city who have historically not paid their water at the commercial level, because we're turning off water for residents who probably have some very low delinquencies, but are we allowing these commercial delinquencies the privilege of staying in that delinquent status over a period of years. And I'm curious, because that amount of delinquency doesn't just happen overnight.
No, it's
Yeah.
happened. The scope that we have
Right.
is like 10 years and then 10 and
Yeah,
beyond.
so that becomes an equity issue. Because if you're gonna turn off poor folks' water, but you got these businesses who aren't paying, then
And-
that's a problem.
And what I'll say, it does fall into that for both, but I think I understand your request in the scope of what you will have
Yeah.
me to review.
Yeah.
So I can provide that, and if that is not sufficient,
Right.
the city manager can direct me to provide additional.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir. We do have a need for a closed session, and if someone would go ahead and read the motion, please.
I move to go into a closed meeting pursuant to Virginia Code subsection 2.2-3711A1 for the purpose of discussing and considering the performance of the city assessor.
Second.
Madam Clerk, would you call the
Wait a
roll?
minute, question. You didn't call the question.
What is the question, sir?
Well, you have to call the question. You took a vote, you take a vote without the question.
What I was getting ready to, the motion is on the floor. The motion was read. It was seconded. So I'm calling for the vote to go into close.
Right, but you gotta call the question first.
What's
Are there
the
any
question?
Yeah. Is there even a need to go into closed session? Because if this is relating to, is this relating to a discussion on an issue of insubordination?
This is relating to a personnel matter. So
No.
sir, you're out of order. This is
Wait a minute,
related. Hold on.
I had the
Hold on.
floor.
Because you don't have the floor.
I had the
because-
floor. I was
because-
talking
No,
and you
now
cut
you don't
across
have
me.
the floor,
You
sir.
can't do that. And
Yes, yes.
I asked for this council to overrule.
We
the
just had a
chair's
motion and a
decision.
second that was on the floor.
No,
We
I
need to
asked
deal with the
council-
motion
no,
and the
I asked
second.
council to overrule.
Sir,
the
you are out of
chair's-
order. We
That's
had a
why I'm-
motion and a second on the floor.
I'm asking council, hold on, I know what I'm doing.
You are out of
Asking
order.
council to overrule the decision of the mayor.
You are out of order, sir. We have a motion and a second on the floor.
If it is dealing with insubordination,
It's dealing with a personnel matter. That
No.
information was given to you all up front. You
that,
are out of
and that's
order.
why I'm saying, if it's over insubordination, there was never an insubordination issue because the assessor works for the council. The assessor does not work for the mayor.
Madam
It is
City
not-
Attorney, could you please address this concern? Because this gentleman is currently out of order, and he does not have the floor.
I'm not
So
out of
I
order.
need you to address the concern
Why is it-
as it relates to, sir, you're out of order because you continue to overrule when I'm trying to explain something. You're out of order. That's what I'm explaining to you. So you can continue to be rude and disrespectful, and that's okay for you, but it's not okay for the order of this meeting. So you are deemed out of order. I have asked the city attorney to address this. We have a motion and a second on the floor, sir. Thank you.
There's a primary motion on the floor to which there's a second. However, the chair has the ability to ask the question, which is for debate. It is a debatable motion. The council member has presented a question, which now is open to the chair to answer. The question is whether this meeting is related to a particular issue, and the chair
And I
has
did
answered
address
that
the question. I said it was related to a personnel matter.
No, that's not.
And so, having answered the question, it is now open for further debate unless the chair closes the debate and then a vote can be taken. Now, there is a secondary motion for that the council member is saying he is asking his colleagues to overrule your answer, which I don't believe is appropriate under these circumstances because it's a debate and
No.
not a ruling.
Not to overrule the answer. It wasn't the answer I was asking the colleagues to overrule. It was to stop the discussion
Oh.
and ruling me out of order. That's what I was.
We had a motion and a second on the floor.
Correct.
And you just explained what the situation was.
My
Sir,
question.
would you please allow me to finish my thought before you interrupt me again? Because you
right on.
continue
Go
to do
right
that.
on. Go right on.
So please don't
Go
interrupt
right
me
on.
anymore.
Go right on.
Because you continue to
Go
be out
right
of order.
on. Go right on.
Sir? What I was sharing with you is, we had a motion and a second on the floor
Yes.
to deal with the matter. He asked for the point of the question.
Right.
I said the point was to discuss a personnel matter, which was communicated in the information that was supported. So what I'm trying to say is, we need to go forward with what the motion and the second was on the floor. You just indicated about the debate. If they want to do it out front, we can do it out front. It doesn't matter to me, but the issue must be dealt with.
Does the chair remove his finding that the council member is out of order? Then we can move forward.
The chair does move his finding.
Remove his finding? Remove?
The chair does, actually, in this particular situation, because I believe that the motion on the floor and the second was in order, and the question, I did answer the question, and he continued, so that made him, in my understanding, out of order.
If the chair rules that he's out of order, then the council member has the ability to appeal that finding and then take a vote, unless you withdraw that finding.
In this situation, so we don't need to carry on, I'll withdraw it.
Okay, then we can move forward to a vote.
We need to move forward to the vote.
The issue involved insubordination, and it was communicated to us through a letter from the mayor that there was insubordination that occurred because a council appointee did not follow the dictate of the mayor. The mayor does not direct council appointees. The council directs council appointees. Therefore, there is no insubordination because there was no direction given to a council appointee by the council. So going into closed session to discuss that would be out of order. The city assessor works for the council, not for individual council members. Therefore, it is not for an individual council member to deem a person in insubordination.
Council, do I have the floor?
You have the floor, ma'am.
Thank you. Councilman, I think those issues relate, the motion for closed session was to address a personnel issue, and the argument that council has made would be something that could be discussed here or more appropriately in a closed session. And so I believe that the issue of talking about just this issue would still be appropriate under the closed session request, which was sent around because it said personnel issue.
Okay, just want to make, you can't go into closed session to discuss a non-issue.
I'm understanding that to be the point of the discussion.
Okay.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. We have a motion and a second on the floor, and we need to call for the vote at this time. Madam Clerk, would you call the roll?
Mr. Barnes?
No.
Mr. Battle?
I'm voting no because we weren't contacted about this incident. The mayor arbitrarily took it upon himself not to include the parties that needed to be involved. No.
Mrs. Lucas Burke?
Yes.
Mr. Moody?
Yes.
Dr. Whitaker?
No.
Mr. Woodard?
Yes.
Mr. Glover? Mayor Glover?
Yes.
We're in close.
Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay. We do have a need to come out of close, and then we will begin our council meeting at 7 p.m. That was to begin at 7 p.m.
I hereby move that each council member certify that to the best of his or her knowledge, 1, only public business matters lawfully exempted from open meeting requirements under the Virginia Freedom of Information Act, and 2, only such public business matters as were identified in the motion by which the closed meeting were convened were heard, discussed, or considered in the closed meeting just concluded.
Second.
Madam Clerk, would you call the roll, please?
Yes, sir. Mr. Barnes? No. Mr. Battle?
No.
Mrs. Lucas Burke? Yes. Mr. Moody?
Yes.
Dr. Whitaker?
No, and did we give our
I'm going to go back
reason?
to that
Okay.
after we're done. Mr. Woodard?
Yes.
Mayor Glover?
Yes.
If Mr. Barnes, Mr. Battle, and Dr. Whitaker could give why they're voting no.
The issue didn't involve one of the council appointees.
Same.
The issue of insubordination was not appropriate for the closed session discussion.
Thank you.